In today's video, we'll be looking at two real caving stories that went terribly wrong. The first one involves a man trapped underground, while thousands gathered above him, listening as his voice slowly faded over 2 weeks. The second one only gets harder to hear. As always, viewer discretion advised. On January 30th, 1925, Floyd Collins, a 37-year-old cave explorer, set out alone into Sand Cave, a narrow limestone system beneath the hills of central Kentucky. Collins had discovered Crystal Cave years earlier and dreamed of finding another spectacular cavern that could become a tourist destination. That morning, he packed light, a kerosene lantern, a small shovel, and food for the day. The plan was simple: push deeper into Sand Cave and map the passages. He didn't realize the rock above him was far more unstable than it appeared. As Collins crawled deeper, the temperature dropped sharply and the air grew heavy. The passage narrowed from a comfortable tunnel into a tight crawl space barely 2 feet high. His lantern cast flickering shadows across jagged limestone walls that pressed inward from all sides. He moved on his stomach, inching forward through cold mud. The deeper he went, the more the cave seemed to tighten around him. He reached a spot about 150 feet from the entrance, where the passage turned sharply downward. Looking back, the first warning sign appeared here. The ceiling above him was fractured, with visible cracks running through the limestone. Small rocks had already fallen into the passage. At the time, Collins dismissed it as nothing more than typical cave debris, but it would matter soon, as Collins maneuvered through the tight turn, positioning his body to slide feet first down a narrow chute. A large rock suddenly broke loose from the ceiling. It crashed down onto his left ankle, pinning his foot against the cave floor with crushing force. He tried to pull back immediately, twisting his body, pushing with his free leg, but the stone held him completely. The rock weighed 27 pounds and sat at an angle that made it impossible to shift. Collins pushed harder, digging his elbows into the mud for leverage, but nothing moved. The stone pressed into his boot, sending waves of pain up his leg. His breathing quickened as the realization set in. He was stuck. Hours stretched into a full day. The cold stone pulled heat from his body, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. His lantern flickered, casting wild shadows across the rock inches from his face. Collins tried calling for help, but his voice disappeared into the darkness. Every attempt to shift his weight sent fresh surges of agony through his ankle. The silence pressed down on him, and slowly the reality began to settle in. No one knew exactly where he was. Eventually, Collins' younger brother Homer realized something was wrong. When Floyd didn't return home, Homer organized a search party and entered Sand Cave the next morning. The group crawled through the passages until they heard a faint response from deep within. When they reached him, Collins was still conscious and remarkably calm, despite being trapped for over 24 hours. The rescuers tried everything. They dug at the mud around the rock and attempted to lift it with crowbars, but the confined space allowed almost no room to work. Each strike of the tools echoed through the cave. They brought Collins food, coffee, and blankets, but the rock would not budge. Word spread quickly. Within days, thousands of people gathered at the cave entrance. Newspapers ran daily updates. Radio stations broadcast live from the site. Engineers proposed digging a vertical rescue shaft from above, bypassing the unstable passage entirely. Work began immediately, but the limestone kept collapsing. One rescuer was killed when part of the shaft caved in. Progress slowed to inches per day. Below ground, Collins' condition deteriorated. The trapped leg swelled grotesquely. Infection spread. Hypothermia crept through his body as relentless cold pulled away his remaining warmth. His voice grew weaker with each conversation. By day 12, Collins stopped responding entirely. By day 14, the rescue shaft finally broke through, But by the time rescuers reached Floyd Collins, he had been dead for 3 days. A single rock had been enough. He had crawled that passage before without incident, but on this day, at this moment, the ceiling gave way. That was all it took. The next story pushes things even further. On March 22, 1959, 20-year-old Neil Moss entered Peak Cavern in Derbyshire, England, alongside a team of veteran cavers from the British Speleological Association. Moss was an Oxford University student studying philosophy, athletic and eager, but relatively inexperienced compared to the others. The group intended to push beyond previously explored territory into a vertical shaft known as the letterbox. It was a challenging descent, but the team felt prepared. They didn't realize that vertical passages create dangers completely different from horizontal crawls. The main cavern was vast, cathedral-like, with towering walls that disappeared into blackness above their heads. Water dripped constantly from unseen heights, creating an echoing rhythm that filled the space. The team's voices bounced off distant rock faces as they moved through passages wide enough to walk upright. But after nearly 2 hours of steady descent, the character of the cave changed entirely. The grand chambers gave way to a claustrophobic vertical crack in the floor, the letterbox. It was barely wider than a man's shoulders and dropped straight down into unknown depths. The mistake wasn't obvious at first. The team discussed the descent carefully, reviewing techniques and safety protocols. Moss had done vertical work before, though nothing quite this tight. When he offered to lead the exploration, no one objected. What they failed to account for was the shape of the shaft itself. It narrowed as it descended, creating a funnel with no clear turnaround point. Moss tied off his rope and began lowering himself into the opening. Unlike the horizontal crawl that trapped Collins, this was a controlled descent into a vertical unknown. At first, the shaft was manageable. Moss braced his back against one wall and his feet against the other, chimneying downward in careful increments. His headlamp beam swept the walls, searching for handholds and ledges. The rock was smooth, polished by ancient water flow. 15 feet down, then 20, the shaft began to narrow. Moss called up that he was going to continue just a bit further. His voice sounded distant, muffled by stone. And then came a different sound, a scraping noise followed by sudden silence. The rope went slack. When the team above called down, Moss responded, but his voice had changed. It was strained, thin. He told them he had slipped during a repositioning attempt and was now wedged in the shaft. He couldn't push himself back up. The walls were too close. His arms were pinned in awkward angles against his body. What happened next unfolded over days, not hours. The team above began working immediately, but the vertical nature of the shaft made every action dangerous. They couldn't simply dig or chip away at the rock. Any falling debris would hit Moss directly. They considered using ropes to haul him upward, but Moss was positioned in such a way that pulling would only wedge him tighter. One team member descended part way, hanging upside down to assess the situation, but couldn't reach Moss without becoming trapped himself. Rescue teams arrived with specialized equipment. They brought rope systems, pulleys, and steel cables. Someone suggested using a winch. Others argued it would crush Moss against the rock. The debate continued while Moss remained suspended in the dark shaft, head angled downward, body compressed. He spoke periodically, his voice floating up from the depths. He described the cold seeping into his bones. He mentioned that his legs were going numb. Hours became a day, then longer. The physiology of being inverted is brutal. Blood doesn't circulate properly. The heart struggles. Pressure builds in the skull. Moss began to sound confused during his brief responses. His sentences became fragmented. Rescuers pumped warm air down through hoses, trying to stave off hypothermia, but the stone conducted heat away faster than they could replace it. On the second day, Moss stopped answering questions. By the third day, there was only silence from below. When rescuers finally managed to widen the shaft enough to reach him, Neil Moss had been dead for hours. The combination of cold, inverted suspension, and restricted breathing had shut his body down. But unlike Collins, whose body was eventually recovered years later, Moss was in a position that made retrieval impossible without risking more lives. The shaft was too unstable, too vertical, too unforgiving. The cave entrance was sealed. Moss remains there still. Gravity became the trap. Once he slipped past the narrowest point, his own body weight worked against him. There was no climbing back. Both men were experienced. Both made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. But underground, there's no margin for error. What looks manageable on the surface becomes something else entirely in the dark.